I cast my mind back to the end of 2009, and I was in my house and having a dinner party. Invited some friends, Stephen and Jackie, to come along, and we were sitting in the kitchen, sort of. I think I was doing some cooking and getting ready and having a chat and relaxing and having an aperitif. And Stephen says to me, "How do you fancy being an election observer?" And Stephen, by the way, is a lawyer friend of mine, so I also have a legal practice, worked in legal practice. And I was thinking, I was going through my mind, that could be quite interesting. Stephen's got a lot of connections. He's, I know he's involved with a lot of different people. Maybe it's elections in Peterborough, or maybe it's somewhere in the Caribbean, which would be nice, wouldn't it? Sort of like a very exotic, but interesting as well. So these things were going through my mind, and so I said, yes, I would.
Sorry, I thought you were in the main building.
Yeah, don't worry. Just giving the intro bit. So I said, yes, yes, I would like that. And then he looked at me and said, in Sudan. And yeah, my reaction was still, I hesitated a bit, but I still, gave positive signals that I would be up for it. I don't know if we developed much further that evening, so we had more to drink and enjoyed ourselves. And he followed it up later. And so that was the kind of start of a journey, which I have to say is probably one of the most significant events of my life. I've done a number of things. I've run a law firm. I've gone to lots of places. But I think this probably stands out in terms of not only what it involved, but also from a personal growth point of view, facing the fears of going to such a place where, what one did know about it, which was very little, was that there was some conflict, and that was going to have to be brought into the mix in terms of the decision that I made. So I'm going to talk today about the background to the Sudanese situation, a bit about Sudanese politics, but not dwell too much on that, because I'm not an expert on it, but through the experience of being an observer, I learned a certain amount as well as reading, and also about the process of being an election observer, and also about the personal experience that I had. So, what is an election observer? An election observer is someone who gathers information and makes an informed judgment on an electoral process without interfering in the process. Whereas an election monitor is somewhat different. You hear that expression, election monitor, sometimes, is to observe the electoral process and to intervene if any of the processes are being violated. So we didn't have this ability to, authority to intervene. There's also something called an election supervisor, which is someone who certifies the validity of the electoral process. That's even going up a step further, and actually giving a stamp on it and saying, yes, this has been properly followed or it hasn't been. So we're observing. There are many different codes for election observers. There's different ones produced by the OECD. That was probably one that we were following at that time. We had a checklist that we were using. The sorts of things that you'd be looking at is just, because they're practical things in one sense. So is the polling station correctly identified? Are there the ballots there? Are the ballot boxes sealed before they're used? Is there a setup which ensures secrecy? voting, how do the ballot papers themselves work? Are they sufficiently clear? Because remember, we're also dealing with a situation with a certain amount of illiteracy as well in this country. Yeah? So it's even more key to have this kind of proper procedure, but not only a clear, transparent procedure, and one that can be followed. Obviously, I can't speak Arabic, so a few words, but I wouldn't be able to check to that extent. And that's a point of limitation up to a point of using foreign election observers that you can't speak the language. So you're looking, but quite a lot of them could speak English that we're dealing with, but not necessarily the voters themselves. What was the role of the observers? How are they treated when they're out? How we're treated matters. Are we given full access to everything? Yeah. Is there propaganda material in the polling station? Siding with one candidate as opposed to another. Is there an orderly queue? I don't know whether you call that an orderly queue or not. It's not that bad. Everyone seems to be behaving themselves there and waiting in line. And so on. Is secrecy maintained throughout? Is there adequate lighting? Who else is present there? Are there other people present and what are they doing there if they're not voting? And also, the whole process through. So does everything finish on time? Is there a closing time? Are there people still there and not been through? And what happens to them? The Sudanese elections were actually originally over 3 days, in April 2010. But in fact, they got extended by a couple of days because, I'll go into that later, because of the delays of ballot boxes and getting things set up. So it was actually extended. But so I'm introducing here the general role of what an election observer is, and that is actually a photograph of the. It's actually a jail, actually, compound, believe it or not. But it has upon it the advertisement, if you like, or the announcement of the election. Come and vote in April. Elections 2010. So everything's being set up. Now, another very important thing is what goes on before the election. And we weren't employed, and I'll talk about how we were employed at the moment. We weren't employed to make inquiries, as I was, to make inquiries or see what was going on before the election occurred, in terms of propaganda, in terms of media influence, in terms of possible intimidation. Yeah? But having said that, there were people in our team who had been there longer. And I will quote from some of the things that they said as well as we go. So this is what I'm wearing here, is my badge. So I was a bit younger then, so it's over 10 years ago. So I actually put that into Google Translate just to make sure that the Arabic did come out what it should do. It's only slightly off in the sense that it says Anthony Wooding at the end, as opposed to Anthony Wooding, but that's probably just a political change. So gives my status there, my name, the organisation, which is the Centre for Foreign Policy Analysis, which I'll talk about in a moment, and this covers all the states, although I was assigned to a particular place in southern Sudan, which I'll go into. Photography allowed. So yeah, so I was wearing this all the time. Pretty much I was there as my authority to be there and to fulfil the role. So what was the organisation that got me there? Well, it's an organisation called the Centre for Foreign Policy Analysis. And obviously this was known to Stephen, my friend. He had some dealings with the organisation and people involved in this. And the gentleman who ran this organisation still, I think, normally exists. A guy called Paul Warcroft is the one on the left there. I mean, he's somewhat younger then as well. He's in his 70s now. That was taken some time back. He was about 70. So the Centre for Foreign Policy Analysis, as it says there, was established in the United Kingdom in 2004 as an independent and non-partisan focus for rigorous research and analysis, where necessary to initiate debate on issues of foreign policy and international and national security. The Centre brings together both academics and those who had hands-on experience in these fields. I mean, the basic criteria of people they were looking for to go on this mission to South Sudan were either there were academics, and there were a number of politics academics. In fact, Paul is engaged in lecturing as well in Wales. And he's got quite an interesting history into journalism in terms of political analysis. Very interesting guy. In fact, these are books that have been written by him. So that's his memoirs, or deadlines on the front line. There's one here about Omar Bashir, of course, who was a key Sudanese president, no longer, but was during this time. We'll go into the personalities then. And this one, the jihadist threat, which is very interesting. So they're all published by the Penn Sword, the particular, as you say, there were similar publications. But they're very interesting books, and he's a key figure. He's also associated with the Ministry of Defence as well, so he had to work for the Ministry of Defence. So the people that were engaged in this mission and probably in other missions would be academics. Would also be the other sort of I wouldn't say extreme, but in terms of difference, would be military people. So, and we valued them very considerably because, I remember I was thinking of the international after the mission had finished, but we stayed on because there was the volcano eruption or ash cloud in Iceland at the end of our mission. So we actually stayed on longer, but we went out into the desert on a coach. It broke down. And the military people immediately took charge and took all out and said, "Give us all your water because we need to ration it." They knew how to deal with things in this kind of, and also security briefings and things like that. So there were military people, and there were also legal people. And I think, rightly or wrongly, and say that because I happen to be there. We are thought of as people who might be useful in these scenarios because we're used to objectivity, we're used to procedure, we're used to making sure that things run according to plan, and hopefully also got critical minds as well. So the combination of about 50 people went out there on this mission to South Sudan. And by the way, when I used to Sudan, not just Sudan, I was South Sudan, to Sudan. In fact, when I used the expression South Sudan, we have to be quite careful about this because at that point, the Sudan was what is now South Sudan, and Sudan were one country. And in fact, these elections were precursor to a referendum which took place the following year, which resulted in a separation of the country into two. Yeah? So probably it would be better for me to describe it as Southern Sudan that I was in, as opposed to South Sudan. Because South Sudan is now a separate title. And so that was, in fact, the elections were always meant to be a precursor to that process of a referendum taking place in the following year. And that was known at the time. So, Paul Moorcraft, his organisation, and that's under his auspices we were going there to observe the election. So, a bit about Sudan at that time. There's a map here which hopefully will help you to get some idea, a lot of information. But, on the left-hand side, Sudan in 2010, and you can see the different states there. You can see Khartoum there. Where I was based was a place called Malakal, which is in the south here. Okay. In fact, I mean, Sudan at that time was about 1 million square miles, and actually was the largest state that since has been obviously divided into two. So there's no longer following the partition. Yeah, so it's now been overtaken by Algeria and DRC in terms of size. Taking Sudan on its own as it is now. So here we have on the second hand, so South Sudan there, and South Sudan here. And its capital is Juba, and there again is Malakal there. Yeah. And so, without going into too much of the history, until 1956, Sudan was the Anglo-Egyptian condominium, so it was quite late to get independence from the empire, really. And there were various governments since then, but a key one that various experiments they had, etc., including military conflicts sometimes. The one that we most know about and was key before I was going there was the presidency of Omar al-Bashir, who was also the subject of that book, who came to be president in 1989. But there's always been a difference of significant, both political and cultural difference between Sudan and I'll call it Southern or South Sudan. Sudan, proper as it is now, Islamic state. This is putting it broadly, and there's been lots of changes, but Omar Bashir would certainly come within that ambit. And South Sudan, Christian and animist. So, in other words, some of the things, I'll show you a photo later on, some of the things that I saw were animist. So there was spiritual relation to nature, the way in which the spirit belief, as opposed to traditional Christian belief. So a very different cultural background. It was really a historical imperial result of the country being one. There were battles between the English and French standoffs at various places. But at the end of the day, it was part of the Anglo-French condominium, then gets separated away from that, and then it has to do with its internal cultural things. You also got Darfur, of course, which I haven't visited, but it's an area where there's been a lot of tension as well. So, also a key feature of the distinction between these areas is that 80% of the oil is in the south, but the pipelines come through here to the coast. Yeah, so you've got a conflict there about who controls the oil in terms of its economic and indeed its political value. So that's an important point as well in relation to this. Another thing, on a personal level, I was able to have a beer in South Sudan because of its Christian animist culture. In Sudan, wasn't able to. So just the difference that you kind of appreciate, probably the food being different, the drink and the entertainment was different as well. We were staying in a hotel that was pretty open in Malakal. So Malakal is the capital of the Upper Nile state, which is one of the states. There are 10 states in the south. You can see them here. They're more or less, they've been slightly reconfigured now that it's an independent state. But essentially, these are areas in there which are political as well as ethnic, and here these different ethnic influences. The biggest one there is the Dinka. You can see that area there. Nuer, and then the other ones, Zande, Bari, Shilluk, and also some Arab. So there is 3% Arab presence in South Sudan. That's not a huge percentage. A lot of the political difficulties. So we've talked about the political difficulties between South and North, but also internally, and both during the election and since, the tensions between these different. I don't know if the word tribe is right, because it sounds a bit archaic. I think sometimes that word is used improperly, really. But different cultural and ethnic presences, allegiances, in particular between these two. So he will mention some of the key figures shortly, but Salva Kiir, who's the president of South Sudan now, Dinka, and the vice president, Makar is Nuer. So that's just an example. They've managed now to have a rapprochement, but even after independence, that took a long time. And there were internal struggles between them in the country. So that gives you an idea of the mix of different groups and different allegiances and ethnicity within South Sudan, which you don't really get so much in the north, where it's sort of generally Arab. You know, Darfur is different from the rest, but it's generally a sort of Arab Islamic territory in the north. So actually, these are the sort of the key figures. So this is Omar al-Bashir, and you know, he was obviously, the elections were for the presidency of Sudan, also the presidency of Southern Sudan, pre-independence, as well as for the National Assembly, for the Assembly of South Sudan, and for state assemblies, and also for state governments. So you have a lot of, I think in the south, there were 12 ballot papers that you had to use, which is particularly for people who are not used to this and hadn't had elections very much, and possibly were literate as well, quite a lot. And there were pictures on them. So you could see, you know, against a name, you would have a picture, a symbol, and sometimes photographs as well of the candidates. But so there's Bashir. Here, this is always wears a hat. He's always this kind of hat. Salva Kiir, who's the front runner in the south. He is the leader of Sudan People's Liberation Movement, the SPLM, which is the civil wing of the SPLA, which is the Sudan People's Liberation Army. And he is currently, he was, well, I'll talk about the result of the election later, but he is now the leader of, and has been for 10 years, the leader of South Sudan.
Could you spell his name for me?
Yeah, okay, so it's Salva, S-A-L-V-A, Kiir, K-I-I-R.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, the gentleman he's shaking hands with is Rick, I think that's Rick, Mackay, R-I-E-K, new word, N-A-C-H-A-R. So he is of the Nuer, and to say, he didn't actually stand in the election, actually. I'm talking about Southern Sudan now. The only serious candidate other than that, the only candidate is this guy here, Lan, L-A-N, Akol, A-K-O-L. And he's from the Shilluk tribe, which actually did have some significant presence in the area that I was in, actually. So, so those two really, those two are heading off against each other. There's a book there a moment, just trying to quote. This is the one about the memoirs. Is it me? Yeah, so the page that I was going to read you from, I was quite interested here from his book, because he refers obviously to the this is quoting from Paul's book. I was head of mission for 50 independent British observers organised by the Centre for Foreign Policy Analysis, the small London think tank of which I was director. The team comprised British civil servants, mainly from the Ministry of Defence, former British officers, lawyers, academics, and local government officials with election expertise, as well as observers from previous missions. Some were long-term observers, so there's one we met out there. We've been there for some time, serving in the country for 2 to 3 months. And most were short-term, placed through the south and partly in the north. We were excluded from Darfur. On the eve of the arrival of the main bodies of 8 of my foreign observers, plus others who joined us, President Bashir made an ill-tempered and ill-judged intervention. He warned any foreigners who tried to delay or interrupt the elections that, quote, we will cut off their fingers and put them under our shoes, unquote. I had some trouble explaining to my teams about to leave from the UK that this was mere hyperbolic out of rhetoric and could be dismissed. They would be met by hospitality, I said, and they were. It's true, we were met with hospitality. But it's interesting, for those something's lost in translation there. But Paul certainly found a way of dealing with it. Those are the key figures. And there, of course, Bashir is now no longer the president. He's facing various charges. But the consequence of the election was that he continued as president, and Salva Kiir became the president of Southern Sudan. And then the following year, there was the referendum. So, in terms of the ballot paper, see that's an extract from the polling guide, and so you've got a lot of papers here, certainly for Southern Sudan, because you'd have all of them. Here you have the executive ballot papers, so you've got President of Sudan, President of Southern Sudan, state governors, and you've got National Assembly ballot papers. There's 3 because it's a complex system. I won't try and explain it fully, but there is, obviously the president is done on the basis of majoritarian, so you can only have one person winning. These assemblies were partly on the basis of plurality, so first past the post, but also partly on the basis of proportional representation with party lists and even a woman-only list, actually, which is interesting, because that was developed there as something we haven't developed necessarily in our country. So it's almost that there's, their proportional system was ahead of ours in that sense.
It's not difficult.
Yeah. So that was for the National Assembly. Similarly for the State Assembly, and also you can see the photographs here, by the way, or symbols that you would have on the papers. Finally, this is for the South Sudan Legislative Assembly. I've got 2 copies of things actually, or something. So unlike the books, so I can pass around other things. This is there's a picture on the front actually. The polling and counting guide, which people might hear about. That is extracted from. This is extracted from that, in fact, in terms of its origin. So you can see this, having those symbols there and having those photographs was going to be of assistance, to people who possibly couldn't necessarily read or fully understand the process without that kind of identification. So I think that is a quite an important point. There's also a statute that they brought in to the National Elections Act of 2008, so quite a bit earlier, which sets out the parameters of the election. So it's interesting, it says here, voters shall satisfy the following conditions to be A, Sudanese, B, 18 years of age, C, registered in the electoral register, and there were problems with registration, in getting people registered on the register. And D, of sound mind, which is actually interesting because that's not something, as far as I'm aware, that we have in this country, that you have to be of sound mind in order to vote. I don't think so. There's arguments that prisoners can vote.
Prime Minister's got sound mind.
Pardon?
No, so I was just muttering politically.
Yeah. I don't think so. I think that doesn't apply here. But so the Act sets out the criteria for each of the votes, how they would work.
No. Yeah, that was something, didn't it? Yeah.
And this is actually a very interesting booklet because it gives us our blueprint for the National Elections Commission is set out here, is set up under the Act. So it sets out their powers here. And the election officials who serve in the election must guarantee that they will abide by the National Elections Act and the rules and regulations, maintain transparency and impartiality at all times, maintain the secrecy of the vote, and protect the privacy of voters' personal information, count and report the results of the voting system at polling station accurately and properly. And it sets out here, I mean, this is what you'd expect, really. It's not different from how we would expect votes to be carried out. Save that, the logistics of doing it were different. Because getting people registered, and indeed they had ID on top of that. So, whereas when we vote in elections, so there's talk about getting ID, isn't there? But currently, as long as you've got you're registered on the list, you're okay. But here, there's reference to not only their identity, but also to prevent any kind of double voting. There's an inking process. And I'll go into that in a moment because that's quite interesting. The way people were inked when they came into the station, so that and that ink would last a certain amount of time, so they couldn't have an opportunity to do a second vote. So that was something also that was a feature of this. So in terms of what we did, or our experience, I'm going to show a short couple of films in it. They're not very long, but they're actually me talking from this hotel in Malakal, basically to cameras. I have my own room. And I thought, even though it's some time ago, they're a useful way of getting a contemporaneous kind of impression of what it was all about. But there, so you see I'm a bit younger there. I seem to be the only one that's not looking at the camera or something. So that was the team. So it was quite a mixed team that we were with. And we basically stayed in this hotel in Malakal. When we arrived
Can you tell us how you were mixed? National?
I don't know if I could be precise about that. Some were American, some were I think, yeah, most of us were British or had British base. That's true. I mean, we might have. We weren't an international team in the sense of, it was a British team of people. It's just that they had different backgrounds. I think that's a better way of describing it. I'm not absolutely sure. There's some of those people at the top, whether they were people from the National Elections Commission who joined us out there, or officials out there, or through other connections, rather than from the Centre of Foreign Policy Analysis themselves.